Hello and welcome back to the third part of this lesson on producing an external view using Rhino and Photoshop. We'll be carrying on from where we left off in the last session using Photoshop to start to add in more texture, colour and some extra elements into the scene to complete this image. Now, where we left off in the last session was we created a colour palette, which was here from some reference images. We applied those on top of our model we downloaded from Rhino, using this basic capture to help us separate out different materials in our model, and then we applied those to different folders within our material adjustments layer, like so, by using masks to separate out each of those key materials. So the one for the wall has a mask for the wall elements, and for the floors, windows, ground, etc. After that, we also added in our rendered shadow layer, which we got from just rendering out the basic shadows using Rhino Render, and we've just overlaid that on top of the image to produce these shadows and give it some more definition. Now, what we'll be doing at the beginning of this session is we're going to start to add in some more textures into our different materials here, and to do that I'm just going to turn off my color reference, and under my material adjustments we're going to start with this ground element. Because I've already made the mask, that means that anything I draw within this folder, so let's see, for example, we just wanted to paint some blue, you see there it's only working in the realms of that mask, which means anything I add into this folder will only be visible through the mask there. If you want to go back and look at how to add masks, just go back to the previous video where I discuss a bit more how to add masks onto folders, because this is quite essential for this part of the lesson. Now, for this ground I've got a kind of basic green texture here, but I actually want to give it some kind of grassy feel to it, so it actually looks a bit more like a meadow or some grassy lawn. So what I'm going to do is I've got some photos of some landscapes here. We've got one here of just a basic kind of bit of grass, and we're just going to overlay this on top of our already green layer here. So I'm just going to take that image and drop it into my Photoshop file, and I've just dropped it onto that layer already. Now, you see there, if I drop it in, it's now sitting on top of that kind of previous green colour we put on top there. Now it's kind of working alright, but I would quite like to keep the colour I've already got for that layer and not to change it to this more sort of yellowy green. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that colour I've previously made and move it on top of the layer and change the blending mode, which is this panel here where it says normal. If you click down, we can put it on a colour blending mode, which means only the colour of this is affecting the object below, and it will blend the two photos together. So now you can see we've got that kind of grassy texture, but it's now blended with the colour of my layer. I'm actually just going to reduce that down slightly, and before I do that actually I'm going to make a white layer behind it so you can't see through it. And then I'm going to reduce this image down a bit, just so it's not as kind of bold in the scene. But there we're starting to get a bit of texture on that grass, which is exactly what I kind of want for this. Just make sure using Control T there to transform and scale up the image if it's not quite big enough. So that's the basic kind of grass texture. We can also add in some texture on the walls here to give this a bit more definition. Depending on the material, you could add different material textures. A good website for looking for different texture types I go to is this one here, textures.com. You can make a free account on that, and it allows you to download textures from concrete, brick, kind of any textures you can think of that you might need to add to your building. And they've got a huge library of different textures to download, and they're all quite good quality, so it's worth having a look on here for different textures if you need, and I'll put a link in the description of this video to this website too. For these walls I'm going to have a go at sort of overlaying some concretey sort of textures on top of there. So I've got some concrete textures here, and I'm just going to drag and drop one of these on top. Now it's moved directly into my ground layer, and I don't want that, so I'm going to just move that into my walls layer up here. So now you can see it's kind of overlaid on there, and because we've got our shadow over the top, it's already kind of getting some colour from the shadow. Now the scale of it's quite big at the moment, so I'm going to just reduce that down, make it a bit smaller so it just sits on top of the building. It might be that you want it kind of a lot smaller than that, and you might have to kind of take it and copy it a few times over to get that scale in correctly. So let's say I wanted it at this scale. I could then, if you hold down the Alt key just on the object you want to copy, you'll see there's a double little arrow that comes up in Photoshop. Then if you click and drag, it will copy the object downwards, and then it will snap to the edge like so. So you can make kind of few copies of that, and you'll see in my layers it's kind of making a copy each time for each one. So I'm going to do that a couple of times, just copying that across like so. And when I've got kind of multiple layers of the same thing, I usually just merge those up to make those a bit tidier back into one layer. Now that's on top. If you want to kind of keep that colour, you might want to put this on a blending mode as well. So sometimes your soft light or your overlay blending modes are quite good at kind of keeping a texture in place. If I zoom in there, you can see that it's still got the graininess of that concrete overlaid on top. Sometimes the multiply can be quite good for this as well, but it will always darken up the image using multiply, because multiply blending mode always kind of lets the black part of the image show up and makes the white part of the image disappear. So when you blend it, it will always darken an image. If you want to kind of darken up an image using a blending layer, you use these kind of top 5 here, and the next 5 here will lighten up the image, and then this selection here will be a mixture of the two. So for when I'm kind of putting textures, overlaying it on a colour, I'd probably use the overlay or the soft light blending mode. And I think for this the overlay is working quite well. I'm going to reduce that down a bit. It might be that you also want to kind of build up multiple textures on top of this as well, and you don't have to just have one texture for each thing. It might be that I sort of want some of this rougher kind of concrete texture on top. That's quite grainy there, but let's scale it down. It might be I want sort of more of this verticality of this texture on, so I can blend this on using a soft light. And then what we can also do is we can give this layer a mask as well. So if we just select the layer and click on this mask option, it will make what's called a blank mask on top. And then if we use the rubber tool, just with the white rubber selected, we can start to rub out areas where we don't quite want this texture to be. And at the moment, because my rubber's on 100%, it's just fully rubbing it out. And you can see there that it's kind of adding to the mask and making a bit more of that texture disappear. If I then decide I want to bring it back, all I have to do is switch the colour of the rubber back to black, and we can rub it back in. So it gives us the option to kind of blend in and out different textures on top of one another. A quick way to switch between black and white is just to press the X key. And usually I turn the opacity of the brush down to sort of 50-30% when doing this, so then it won't fully rub stuff out. So you can kind of ease stuff away in certain areas and kind of leave it darker in others. Might be that you want more texture at the base of the building and less at the top, maybe. I think I'm going to ease down that grass a bit as well. So you can very quickly start to kind of build up your image, add more texture on top, and start to kind of create something that looks a bit more sort of realistic if you want that sort of look, or just giving it a bit more texture character from that point. It might also be that you sort of want to add some texture to this water, if you've got any water in your scene, and if you've only just rendered it as a flat object like I have here. A lot of the time you don't actually need to render out water, you could just overlay an image on top to get that texture. So I've got, let's go down to our water folder here, and I've got this kind of image of water, this lake above, and we can just overlay that on top there. I'm going to just crop out the sky for this image because I think we're going to add a different sky in. Whenever you want to kind of crop out part of an image that you don't need, never delete the image. I always mask it off just in case you want to get it back at a later date. So if you say I want to get rid of this top bit, just select it, and if you hit the mask it will kind of just show that, and then you can do what's called inverting the mask by switching around which bit it's showing, which bit it's hiding. And if you just press Control I on the mask, it switches it to just show the bottom half there. So now I've got that water on. We then choose a different blending mode to overlay it on top of the previous water we have. Now maybe a soft light might be good for this. I might use a combination of two actually. So I might use a soft light to get that ripple, and then maybe let's try a screen just to brighten up a little bit, just to get a bit of that texture kind of on top of the water there. And then it may be that if it's looking a bit bright, you can always use an adjustment layer down here. So if we select this hue saturation, give it the same layer mask there, you can just desaturate that a bit if it's looking a bit bright coming through. So very quickly you can just start to kind of build up the textures in your image and start to add a bit more detail, just using the method of just overlaying photos in the previous folders you've made. And I mean, you can kind of infinitely add textures on these to add more and more detail. Kind of the more you do, the more kind of detailed your image will look, and I highly recommend going into each of these folders, setting up a folder for each material, and then building up the textures and the kind of material finishes of each of those as you go. Now, the next stage I want to look at is adding kind of more vegetation, some trees and plant life into this image. What I'm actually going to do first is, I kind of feel like this feels like it should be a portrait image, not a landscape, so I'm actually going to crop it off the sides a bit. I think we're going to do it slightly off center. You can use these kind of thirds in your crop panel to help compose your image sometimes. It's quite nice to line up building elements with a third line, because visually that kind of works quite nicely. So I'm going to make it a little bit taller. I'm going to get rid of a bit of foreground here. I'm just going to stretch it up a bit, like so. And when you're happy, you can just hit the tick up here. Now because of that, I'll kind of need to extend up my sky, so I can do that now. Just going down to this sky colour I put in, doing Control T to transform, and then just dragging that upwards like so. This part here looks like it's a bit of sky from that water texture as well, so I can go and hide that just using, I'll just apply this mask onto the layer. That's so there we go. So we've made our image slightly larger, we've got a sort of more portrait image going on now, and now I think we're going to try and add some trees into the foreground here. So what I'm going to do is, I've got a few cutout trees here which I've just downloaded online. These were free, and I'll share the link of where I got these from in the description as well, but you can usually find them just by googling cutout trees. And I'm just going to drop a couple of these in to work with. So let's try this one for now. So these ones are quite good because they're already cut out. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drag this above my material adjustment layer and above my shadows as well. And we're going to make a new folder called vegetation, and I'm going to make this green. Just drop that in. So we can size this up. It's quite good with trees just to sort of note roughly where the light's coming from and match that with the lighting in your scene. Maybe we'll do one at the background first. And you'll find a lot of the time, obviously we've kind of brought in this tree straight from a photo, and at the moment it kind of doesn't really match the aesthetic of our image we're going for. And like with all of these trees, they're all taken from photographs of real trees, so we'll find that when we drag them in, it might be that they don't quite kind of match up with the look we're getting for in our image, and we might need to sort of edit them to help match up with the image we're doing. So one way of kind of helping merge up your trees or match them to your particular image style, or just to simplify the tree a little bit, is what we can do is we can take this tree for example, and I'm just going to rasterize the layer just by right clicking and going rasterize layer here. And what we can do now is if we go to filter on that layer and filter gallery, I use this filter called the cutout filter in Artistic, and it's much like the image trace in Illustrator as well, but it just simplifies an image down into a series of colours, and you can specify the amount of colours in that image by the number of levels here. So the less levels, the more simple it would be. And I think for this, I might go for something like 7 there. Yeah, okay, so that's already kind of just simplified that tree image down a little bit, so it's not as detailed as it was before. And it might be that we also want to match the colour with our colour scheme on our image. What I'll do then is I'll kind of bring up my reference panel, just make sure it's at the top. I realise I've kind of cropped off part of that, so drag that over. And I'll probably just take a colour from here. Let's try this darker green. And what you can do is if you make a layer above the tree you've just done, fill it in with that colour, and then hold down the Alt key between the colour layer and your tree, and you'll see this little arrow and a box connecting them, and this means we can connect our top layer with the one below it. And there, that colour will now only affect that tree. So it's kind of just overlaying the colour on top. We could always just put it on a colour blending mode, or we can try out some sort of other blending modes to help sort of overlay that colour. Sometimes it might be that you just want sort of a solid colour for your trees and keep them quite simplistic in that sense. We could start to build them up just by sort of adding in a block colour on top of them. So what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to take a few of these trees here, and we're just going to layer them on the image and start to build up the image using these trees. Now I'm going to pause the video and kind of then talk through how I've done that afterwards. So now I've finished composing the trees in my image. You can see here my sort of tree group I've made, that we have some foreground trees and some background trees. Now these two sort of are in the foreground, which are helping frame the kind of edges of my building, which is quite nice to use these for that. And then I've got these sort of ones sitting in the background. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use my colour palette to help then colour these trees up to sort of match the look I'm going for. And for the foreground trees, I'm actually going to use this darker colour here to colour these in. And we're going to just, as we did before, make a layer above that group, fill it in, on the foreground, and then hold down the Alt key to clip that layer to the group to add the colour to those trees. And I'm going to keep it as a solid colour for now. Then for the background trees, I've actually sort of made this green colour already. And I'm going to just clip that. Just make sure it's sat above that folder. And clip that to the group. I'm just going to reduce that down a bit. And I think with this one, let's have a look and see. Maybe if we put it on a multiply and reduce it slightly. Do that, and then I'm also going to make a copy and put it on a colour just to give it that sort of darker blue colour which I'm going for. And my reference there, so that's kind of working, we're getting there a bit. So we've got this kind of darker foreground trees sort of flanking it and some lighter ones in the distance. I might also take one of these darker colour layers and add it to those distance trees just to give them a kind of slightly tone of that darker blue. And I mean, you can play around with this just using those reference colours to help blend in your trees a bit and sort of create that sort of image you're looking for. But the general thing is I'm trying to use these trees to help frame my image up. Now you'll notice as well that we'll kind of need the reflection of these trees in the water to help play up that kind of mood we're getting for as well. So what I'm going to do is hide my foreground trees for now, and we're just going to select just marquee tool using the square marquee over the top of those trees. I'm going to copy this by using a copy merge, which means it will copy sort of all the layers below my selection. And to do that, you can either go edit, copy merged here. If you just do copy, it will only copy whatever the layer you're selected on. So if you do copy merge, it will copy everything and all the trees at once. So I'm going to do copy merge, and then we're going to go down to our water layer back in our materials, down to water, and we're going to paste it there. Now I'm going to take those trees, I'm going to transform, Control T, we're going to drag them down, and we're going to flip them upside down. So we're basically mirroring that reflection in the water. Then if I turn it, put it on a soft light, blending mode is usually quite good for this. We can then kind of line them up of where they need to be. Put a mask on the layer and just rub out any excess bits. Just making sure it's on 100, isn't there? Just to rub out the edges there. And now we've got that reflection working quite nicely. Might be that you just want to reduce that down a bit. Sometimes with reflections you might want to put the rubber on like a 20% just on that mask. And the reflection usually kind of reduces at the edges and is a bit stronger where it's touching the tree. So you can get that effect as well, just by sort of rubbing out the tops there. So yeah, that's looking quite nice. So then we can hide that layer again, go back up, turn our foreground trees back on. There. Now, if I was doing kind of more to this image, it might be that I want to add some sort of shrubbery in the foreground. But for the last part, we're just going to look at adding people and how to start doing that. So very simply, we're going to just have a look and find a simple cutout person. There are lots of different places you can find cutout people online, and I'll share some links to where you might be able to get those, but we've got a few different ones here. Let's see if we can find someone suitable for this particular image. Let's have a look. You might want someone kind of in more summer clothing to match the kind of sunny image we're going for, but let's just find. What we're going to do is we're going to kind of take an image of a person and then we're going to try and sort of distort it a bit to help match in with the tone of the image we've got going for us at the moment. So let's have a look. Let's try this girl for starters out here. So I've just drag and dropped it into the file, and we're going to move it above the vegetation layer, and we're going to make a new layer called people. I'm going to color code this group. Yeah, we've got a blue, haven't we? Let's do it in a red for now. Drop her in there. So first thing to do is kind of size it to the right scale. It might be sometimes in my Rhino file I'll set a box at a person height, put it in the scene to help me then adjust and work out where my kind of eye level for people is. For kids it's a lot harder because obviously they're not at a person's eye level, so you have to do it a bit smaller, but I'm just going to do this one by eye for now. Let's have her in here just pointing at the building like so. So with the character as well, I might also, we can kind of distort her a bit and make her look a bit more sort of stylized. I might use the filter gallery and cutout effect for that as well. Sometimes this works better than others. You can see here it's kind of distorted a little bit and we can't really see, it's kind of blurring the features of her a bit. So let's try and, I think actually one of these ones is kind of the best, isn't it? Let's go for this for now. And it might be actually that I make a copy of that layer just by holding down the Alt key there and dragging the layer to copy it, filtering the top one, and then just overlaying it on top. So we're getting a slight sort of filtered look to it, but it's not completely covering up the image below, so we can still kind of make out the details of the person below. And also then we're going to put her in her own group. Foreground girl. And I'm going to take one of these colours from my colour palette, fill it in again and just clip it to that folder. And then we're just going to overlay the colour on as well. And this, I do this sort of to anything I'll bring in the scene just to help sort of match up those colours to the tones I'm looking for. And it will just help sort of bring the rest of the image together. So she's kind of working quite well there. Might be as well that you want to add a shadow to the person. Now, an easy way to do that is if you hold down the Control key on that layer of the girl, you'll select her outline. Then we can make a new layer. And you want to make this below her layer because it's going to be her shadow. I'm going to move the selection, well, first we're going to fill it actually. So we're going to take a dark sort of shadowy colour from our colour palette, fill in that selection, then we're going to move it out of the way. All we have to do is transform, Control T, flip it vertically so it's upside down, and then I'm going to distort it just by right clicking and go distort, and we're just going to kind of move it into the rough angle it would need to be. So it'll probably be something like this. When you've got that looking about right, you can then put it on a multiply, blending mode, and drop down the fill, and it can act as her sort of shadow on the ground there. It might be that you want to edit it a bit if that hand doesn't quite look right for the shadow. You could just add a mask and rub it out. See, I'm adding a mask again just in case I don't want to bring it back at a later date. Like so. So there we go, we started to add a character in, and it might be that I could then add lots of different people. We could have some of the background, some of the foreground, adding to our scene, and it's very easy just to start dropping them in, taking the colours from our colour palette and just building up the image in that way. In terms of layering structure, I always keep my folders in this order, and the reason for that is that people and trees always want to be sort of on top of everything else you've done, so it's good to sort of layer them up in this way, and it's quite good if you're kind of stuck for how to layer up your Photoshop files to copy this structure from this file here. Now for final kind of tweaks on an image, I'll make a final folder and I'll call it Atmosphere, and this is sort of for final atmospheric tweaks we want to do to the image. It might be for this one I actually might want to kind of crop in just a little bit more. Let's crop it in a little bit more there for the final version. And I'm actually going to tweak that vegetation. So you should never be merging any layers kind of going forward. You always want to be able to go back and tweak stuff later on. So then if I wanted to sort of move this tree across a bit more, I can do that. Now for this final atmosphere layer, there's kind of lots of different tweaks you might want to do. Something that's quite good is in your adjustment layers down here, we can use the color lookup option. What this does is basically almost like an Instagram filter technique. And if you select color lookup and click on this load 3D UT option here, there's lots of different kind of presets for different ways the image could be filtered. And look, so we click on the two stripe, it's kind of one color option. If we then use our direction up and down keys on our keyboard, you can just cycle through different filters to add. Some of them work better than others for different image types. It might be that you kind of want one that picks up different bits. Let's have a look. So maybe that something like that sort of brightens up the image a bit. We can knock it down just using the filters. What did it look like before and after? It's kind of just brightening up the whole thing. I might put it on about 20%. Another technique I sometimes use is putting on a black and white filter on top, and then if you change the blending mode of this to soft light, it just makes the whole thing a little bit more contrasty and punchy, which sometimes works, but I'll just reduce that down a bit as well. You could also, sometimes I might get some textures and just overlay it over the top of the whole image. So let's see if we can find some kind of concrete texture again. Concrete works quite well for this. Any kind of texture that gives it a bit of grain or something is helpful, just sort of overlay on top of the whole image to kind of tie everything together. So let's try some of these. That's a bit too grainy. That one might work. So I'll just drop that in, scale it up, and we're going to put it on a soft light texture. You see there, it's just kind of adding a sort of washy grain to the top of it, which works quite nicely, tying that together. I've also got a paper texture here which works quite well. If you're looking for a kind of more watercolour effect, you can just scale that up, overlay it, and put it on soft light. It's usually quite good, blending mode, or maybe an overlay. A soft light. And you can see there it's just giving it that kind of papery grain effect, which can help with an image that's a bit more posterized like this. So very quickly we can just start to kind of add a bit more texture and make it a bit more sort of painterly, or more like a painting or photograph from that point. Now, once I've kind of hit this point, and I might be sort of at the end of finishing an image like this, the last thing I'll do is I'll just select the whole image, hit Control-Shift-C, which is copy merge, which copies everything in my image. We're going to paste it on top, so we've just got a blank image on top. And then we go Filter, Camera Raw filter here, and this is like a final image tweak filter we can do. And here we can adjust the temperature of the image if we want to make it warmer or cooler. The clarity option is quite good for sort of darkening up. Oops, sorry, not the dehaze. Clarity there. Texture kind of adds to that texture, and it's just good to sort of play around with these sliders just to sort of do those final tweaks to your image. Contrast a bit, and when you're done you just hit OK, and it will just apply those on top. And there you have it. There, I'm kind of finished with that now, and I'm quite happy with how that's turned out. So that was a quick sort of A to Z of how to quickly create a perspective view in using Rhino and Photoshop, just using simple kind of screen capture from Rhino and a shadow layer in Photoshop. I'm going to upload this Photoshop file onto Owler as well, so you guys can download it along with watching these videos. And yeah, any questions, just let me know in the next session we do. Thanks for watching.